3 experienced and highly recommended nannies, each with impressive resumes and years of work with difficult children, tried everything they could to make the billionaire's restless twin boys sleep. They sang lullabies, read books, and enforced strict bedtime rules, but nothing worked. The children stayed awake night after night, full of energy, until one evening a quiet woman with simple clothes, calloused hands, and a calm look walked into their home. She did not scold them or order them to bed. Instead, she sat on the floor, opened a small, worn book, and told a story that slowly drew the boys closer until they fell asleep in her arms. And only much later did she reveal the unbelievable and heartbreaking truth about where she really goes when she leaves the house after work each night. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. 3 nannies had already given up before she even arrived. Each one had tried everything they could think of to make the billionaire's twin boys go to sleep. They had sung lullabies until their throats were sore, read stories from big colorful books, and enforced strict bedtime rules, but nothing worked. The boys were full of energy, running around the house like they had no intention of stopping. When she showed up that evening, she wore a plain uniform, her hands rough from years of work, and her calm eyes didn't seem to promise any miracles. The housekeeper led her to the living room where the boys were wrestling on the carpet and laughing loudly. Instead of telling them to quiet down, she simply lowered herself to the floor and slowly pulled a small, worn-out book from her bag. Its cover was faded, pages bent, as if they had been read countless times. Without asking for silence, she opened it and started to tell a story. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a rhythm that made the boys stop for just a second to listen. She used her hands to act out what was happening, changing her tone for each character. At first, they stayed where they were, tossing a pillow between them and pretending not to care. But their eyes kept drifting toward her, curious about the way she spoke. After a few minutes, one of them moved closer, still holding his toy car. The other followed slowly. She didn't rush them or demand their attention. She just kept talking, her voice switching between a deep growl and a squeaky whisper. Eventually, they were both sitting right in front of her, watching her hands move in the air as if the characters were alive. She reached into her bag and pulled out 2 small wooden figures, each shaped like a different animal. They weren't fancy toys, just simple hand-carved shapes, but she used them to act out scenes. The boys leaned in so close their knees touched hers. Every time she paused for dramatic effect, they giggled or whispered about what they thought would happen next. The more she spoke, the slower their movements became. The older of the 2 rested his head on her knee, still holding his toy car. The younger sat beside him, his eyes blinking more slowly now. She didn't tell them it was bedtime. She didn't have to. Her story had pulled them into a quiet, safe place where sleep didn't feel like an order. It just happened naturally. Within minutes, the younger boy lay sideways on the carpet, not moving. His eyelids grew heavier with each sentence. The older one climbed onto the sofa and curled into the corner, his head drooping. She kept reading softly, her voice low and steady until the younger boy shifted to lie down completely. She gently lifted him onto the sofa beside his brother, making sure they were both comfortable. One rested his head against her shoulder, the other's hand still loosely wrapped around his toy car. She adjusted her position so they could each lean against her. The story ended, but she stayed silent, letting their breathing slow until it was clear they had drifted into deep sleep. The room was quieter than it had been all night. The faint hum of the air conditioner was the only sound now. She sat there without moving, one arm around each child, feeling their soft breathing. The book rested in her lap. She thought about how simple it had been. No special tricks, no expensive gadgets, just time, patience, and a little imagination. For her, moments like this weren't about winning or proving something. They were about connecting. That was when the door opened quietly. The boy's father stepped inside wearing a tailored suit. He had expected noise, maybe even chaos, but instead he saw something he hadn't witnessed in a long time. Both of his sons asleep, their faces calm and peaceful. She didn't notice him at first. He stopped at the doorway, watching in silence. His expression softened. Something in him shifted at that moment. This woman had done what no one else could. Over time, she developed a routine that happened the same way every night. After dinner, when the house had started to settle, she would quietly go to the living room. She never made an announcement. Instead, she would turn off half the lights, leaving a soft glow. Then she would take a thick blanket from the sofa and carry it to the same corner where she always sat. She lowered herself to the floor, leaning against the wall, arranging the blanket around her legs. She didn't look toward the boys or signal for them, but somehow, without fail, they would appear within minutes. Sometimes they came together, sometimes one arrived first, dragging a toy or rubbing his eyes. They never said much at first, but they always moved closer until they were pressed against her side. They seemed to know this was their time. The boys would settle down without her asking, curling into the space between her arms and the wall. She didn't always begin with a book. Sometimes she just sat in silence, letting them adjust until they were comfortable. Then she would speak, not loudly, but with a steady tone that immediately changed the room's mood. The topics varied. Some nights it was a story she knew by heart. Other nights, something she invented on the spot. She never rushed. The father had started noticing this habit. At first he thought it was coincidence that the house became quieter at the same time every evening. But when it kept happening, his curiosity grew. Sometimes he would pause in the hallway where he could see into the living room without being noticed. From that distance he could see how the boys leaned into her, how still they sat. He was struck by the way she held herself, not stiff but not slouched either. He couldn't understand how it worked. It wasn't only her words. She had a way of speaking that included long pauses, as if she was letting the silence work alongside her voice. When she looked at the boys, she held their eyes for just the right amount of time, enough to make them feel seen without making them uncomfortable. Her tone was always steady, never sharp or impatient. Even when one of them fidgeted or interrupted, she responded with the same calm pace. The more he watched, the more it seemed she was guiding them into a state where their thoughts slowed and their bodies followed. It wasn't just storytelling, it was something deeper. He began to wonder where she had learned to do this. She had no official training that he knew of, no impressive qualifications in childcare, yet she seemed to know exactly how to move, when to speak, and when to remain silent. It didn't take long before the boys began to look for her at other times of the day. In the mornings, if they heard her in the kitchen, they would run in to see what she was doing. Sometimes they offered to help, even if their help meant spilling flour or dropping spoons. She never turned them away. If she was peeling fruit, she let them hold the peels. If she was stirring a pot, she let them stand on stools to see inside. During the afternoons, when she folded laundry, they often sat nearby telling her stories about their toys and friends. She listened without rushing them, her hands busy, but her attention fixed on their words. Even when their stories wandered, she nodded and asked questions, making them feel like everything they said mattered. The boys seemed drawn to her patience. She sometimes told them small stories while she worked, not as elaborate as the ones at night, but enough to keep them smiling. She would talk about animals or make up short tales about objects around the house. Even though she listened to everything they wanted to share, she didn't talk much about herself. If they asked about her favorite food, she gave a quick answer and then asked about theirs. If they wondered where she lived, she would smile gently and say something vague before turning the conversation back to them. The boys noticed her way of changing the subject, but they didn't mind. They liked her presence more than any detail she could give about her life. Her quietness about herself made her seem even more mysterious to them. The father noticed this as well. He saw how naturally she avoided talking about her own life. She didn't act nervous or defensive. She simply redirected the moment, always with that same small, polite smile. It was late at night when the storm began. The rain had been falling softly, but then the thunder came, loud, sharp cracks that shook the windows and made the boys open their eyes in fear. The younger one was the first to sit up in bed, his face tense. Another rumble came, even louder, and the older one quickly got out of bed. Without saying a word to each other, they ran down the hallway, their bare feet tapping against the cold floor. They turned the corner into the living room and found her there as if she had been waiting. She was sitting on the floor with a large blanket already spread out beside her. When she saw them, she lifted the edge, inviting them in without a single question. They rushed toward her, climbing under the blanket, their bodies pressed close for comfort. The storm outside didn't slow down. The wind hit the windows with heavy bursts, and the rain made fast, steady patterns against the glass. The boys were still shaking, so she began to speak. Her voice was low, almost like she was sharing a secret. She didn't try to cover the sound of the rain. Instead, she spoke in a way that made it feel like the storm was part of the moment. She started with a familiar scene, but then her words shifted. She began to describe a wide, open space, unlike their house, where the ground stretched far in all directions. She spoke of a cold wind that made you pull your clothes tighter, and of faint city noises that seemed far away, like echoes from a different place. The boys leaned against her arms, listening closely. As she continued, her story felt different from the ones she usually told. It wasn't filled with magical animals or talking objects. This time it felt like she was remembering something she had really seen. Her voice slowed when she described the way the sky looked, big and heavy, with a pale light breaking through. She spoke about how the wind carried a smell she couldn't name, but it made you feel both alone and awake at the same time. The boys didn't understand everything, but they didn't interrupt. Their eyes stayed on her face, watching the way her gaze drifted slightly away, as if she wasn't in the room anymore, but standing in that open place she described. The rain tapped harder, and the thunder returned in short bursts, but the boys didn't flinch anymore. They were too focused on her words, on the strange mix of calm and distance in her tone. The father, who had been in his study down the hall, heard the soft murmur of her voice. At first, he thought it was the usual late-night comfort, but the tone caught his attention. He walked quietly toward the living room. When he reached the doorway, he leaned slightly to see them. The boys were wrapped in the blanket beside her, both looking up at her like they didn't want to miss a single word. Her voice was steady, but there was something in it he hadn't heard before. He stepped closer, slowly, not wanting to break the moment. For the first time since she had come to work for him, he wanted to hear the story too. He had almost reached the sofa when she noticed him. Her eyes shifted from the boys to him in the dim light, and just like that, she stopped talking. The story ended mid-thought, as if she had shut a door that could not be opened again. The boys looked up at her, confused, but she only smiled gently and adjusted the blanket around them. 2 days later, the house was calm. In the late morning, the father was in his office, sitting at his desk, focusing on documents that needed his signature. The boys were supposed to be in the playroom building something with their blocks. He heard footsteps in the hallway before they appeared at the door, standing side by side. Without hesitation, the older one spoke first. "Dad," he said. "She told us that when she leaves here, she goes to her place under the bridge." The father froze in his chair, his pen still in his hand. He blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "What?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even, but the boys didn't seem to notice his reaction. They just kept talking, filling in more details, their words coming out with the natural honesty children often have. They explained how she had described it. Not as a sad or frightening thing, but simply as a fact. "There's a lot of wind there," the younger one said. "You can hear the water all the time, like a big river," the older one added. "She has a mattress, but it's old and it's right on the ground." They spoke over each other sometimes, each eager to repeat something they remembered. It was clear to him that they believed every word. He tried to process it, thinking maybe they had misunderstood, maybe she had been telling them another story. But the way they described the sounds, the smell, the cold, it matched something too specific to be invented. His mind flashed back to that stormy night, to the moment he had stood at the doorway and heard her speaking of an open space, cold wind, and the distant sound of the city. The boys didn't stay long after that. Once they had shared what they wanted to, they returned to the playroom, leaving him in the office with their words echoing in his head. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the papers on his desk, but not reading them. Under the bridge, the phrase kept repeating in his mind. He pictured it without wanting to, the space beneath the concrete, the constant hum of traffic overhead, the rush of water beneath, the wind cutting through the open air. He imagined a thin mattress placed on the ground, worn from time, maybe damp from moisture. His jaw tightened as he tried to make sense of it. How could someone with so little give so much? The more he thought about it, the more the weight of it pressed on him. He remembered the other nannies who had come before her, all of them with better clothes, better addresses, better circumstances, and none of them had managed to reach his sons the way she had. She didn't have her own comfortable home to return to, yet she made his house feel safer and warmer for his children than it had been in months. He thought about her quietness when they asked personal questions, the way she smiled but never answered directly. It made sense now. She hadn't been hiding something to be mysterious. She'd been protecting her dignity, not wanting them to see the reality of her nights. That thought hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't pity he felt. It was respect mixed with a deep sense of gratitude that words couldn't match. He sat there for a long time, the weight of this new knowledge sitting heavy in his chest. That night, after the boys were asleep, he stayed in the hallway for a moment, listening to the quiet inside their room. Their breathing was steady, their faces relaxed. He knew it was the right moment. He walked toward the living room where she was folding the blanket they had used earlier. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice calm. She turned toward him, a little surprised, but nodded. He led her to the dining table, not with the intention of confronting her, but simply to have a conversation. Sitting across from her, he took a deep breath before speaking. He didn't bring up the details the boys had shared. Instead, he started with gratitude. He told her he had been watching the change in his children, how they now went to bed without protest, how they woke up rested and smiling. Then he said he understood why her stories felt so real, because they came from her own life. She lowered her eyes at that, her hands folding together in her lap. He didn't push for an explanation. Instead, he explained that he respected her privacy, but he wanted her to know he saw the value of what she had given his family. He glanced toward the hallway where the boys' room was and added, "You don't have to go back there." He didn't name the place, but they both knew what he meant. There was a short silence. She looked at him as if unsure whether to believe he was serious. "It's late," she said quietly, almost as if trying to change the subject. But before she could say more, small footsteps approached. They both turned toward the doorway. The twins stood there, their hair messy from sleep, eyes half closed. Without asking what was happening, they walked forward and wrapped their arms around both of them. The older boy pressed his face against her side, mumbling something that made them both stop. "Now you're part of our family," he said in a drowsy voice. The younger one nodded, clinging to her arm. She looked down at them, her mouth opening slightly like she might say something, but no words came. The father stayed quiet too, not wanting to interrupt the moment. Instead, he simply met her eyes and gave a small nod, a silent agreement that he wasn't going to argue with his son's declaration. The boys didn't stay long. Their tiredness pulled them back toward their room, but the feeling they left behind stayed in the air. When she finally looked back at him, her expression had softened, but there was still a trace of hesitation. She asked if he was sure, if he understood what it meant. He told her yes, without a doubt. He explained that this wasn't just about offering her a roof, but about acknowledging that she had already become part of their lives in a way that couldn't be undone. He said the boys trusted her completely, and so did he. She shook her head slightly, like she wanted to resist, but the corner of her mouth lifted just enough to reveal a small, careful smile. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the kind of pause that comes when both people understand something important without needing to say much more. He got up and walked toward the boys' room again, letting her follow at her own pace. From the doorway, they could see the twins already curled back under their blankets. One of them shifted in his sleep and muttered something about a story. She stepped closer, adjusting the blanket over them with the same gentle care she always used. The father stood behind her, watching, feeling the decision settle inside him. This was no longer about charity or an act of kindness. It was about doing what felt right for his family, and that now included her. When she straightened up, he told her simply, "This is your home now." She didn't reply, but the way she exhaled told him she had heard him clearly. From that night on, she didn't leave after her work was done. She stayed, moving through the house as naturally as if she had always belonged there. The boys adjusted without question, as though it had been this way all along. Every night they still asked for a story before bed, and every night she sat with them until their eyes closed. Her voice, steady and warm, filled the room while they drifted off, knowing she would still be there when they woke up. For the father, there was a quiet relief in seeing them so at peace. But there was also a deeper recognition that the woman who had once had no place to call her own now had one, and that it was with them. In giving his sons a sense of calm, she had found a home, and in welcoming her, they had gained more than they ever expected. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.